In this lecture, we're going to look at the various business techniques and practices of some of the industrialists, how some of the businessmen of the Gilded Age gave back to society, the idea of social Darwinism. We'll take a look at the events where businesses and labor clashed, and end with looking at labor unions and their purpose. As a review, remember one way to look at the business leaders was as captains of industry, men who rose to riches and power through hard work and personal risk, men who were innovative and successful because of their own hard work, someone who had truly achieved the American dream and in so many cases also gave back to American society. The other way of looking at these men was as robber barons, men who were the only out for themselves and to grow their own fortunes, men who rose to power through the exploitation of their workers, through government corruption, and through shady and ruthless business practices. As we end our study of the Gilded Age businessmen, keep in mind how the business practices we study and the events we look at both in this lecture and in the previous two, and decide if you think that they should be remembered more as captains of industry or as robber barons. As I mentioned previously, Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller were two businessmen who rose to power in the United States. The two men would have a bitter rivalry and competed with one another to be the richest man in America. Both Carnegie and Rockefeller would pioneer and use new business practices to create monopolies in their respective industries. As a review, remember that John Rockefeller was an American oil tycoon and Andrew Carnegie was a steel magnate. A monopoly is when you own or control all or at least most of the business in some given industry. As they expanded their businesses over the years, Rockefeller and Carnegie would both create monopolies and dominate their competition. Rockefeller would come to control 90% of the American oil industry, and Carnegie would have the largest steel company in America. Monopolies are unfair to small competitors and dangerous to the American consumer. But before we look into that, let's look at first how you create a monopoly. To gain an advantage in business and outlast your competitors, you need to try and figure out a way to cut your cost of supplies and cost of production so that you can offer your product to consumers at a lower cost while still maximizing your profits. Vertical integration was one way of doing just that. Vertical integration is the process of controlling all aspects of production, from raw materials to finished goods. One of the first who figured out how to do this was a Chicago meat packer named Gustavus Swift. Swift owned his own ranches and had already figured out a way to maximize his profits by pioneering an assembly line mode of production in his slaughterhouses, but he would still lose some of those profits to shipping costs at the hands of railroad companies. To combat that and cut out the middleman, Swift invested in his own refrigerated railroad cars. Now he did not have to pay a company to deliver his refrigerated meat. By using his own cars, his meat was making it to its markets and costing him less to do so. Swift's profits allowed him to expand, and while he did so, he would eventually also cut costs by owning his own storage houses and delivery wagons, and in time he was able to send refrigerated meat out to cities and towns at a cheaper price than local butchers could offer, who he soon began to put out of business. Other meat packers around the country would also follow suit, and by 1900, 5 meatpacking companies, all of whom were vertically integrated, controlled 90% of the U.S. meat industry. In the steel industry, Andrew Carnegie was able to successfully implement vertical integration to gain control of a steel empire. After expanding his steel plants, Carnegie bought out all of his suppliers, the coal fields and iron mines, ore freighters, and some railroad lines to control production from raw iron to the finished steel beam. John Rockefeller's Standard Oil rose to prominence with the demand for kerosene and would implement vertical integration like Swift. Rockefeller would control production and sales all the way from the oil well to the kerosene lamp. He took out a big stake in the oil fields, added pipelines to cut out some of the railroads, and negotiated cheaper rates for shipping with others. He even had his own timber companies to make cheap oil barrels, and in doing so, created a vast business network. As businesses like Standard Oil successfully implement vertical integration, it can also begin with the practice of predatory pricing. With profits being gained through vertical integration, Standard Oil began to reduce the price of its kerosene. Before you think, wow, this is really nice for the American consumer, it wasn't. The price of Standard Oil was being reduced to put strain on Rockefeller's competitors, not to help out the American consumer. For a while, this works out well for some of us. Americans, of course, are going to buy the cheaper Standard Oil, and cheaper anything for the American consumer is great. Rockefeller is still making a fortune by having implemented vertical integration and controlling the means of production, so he's doing just fine. But as more and more Americans chose Standard Oil over small competitors, more and more of Rockefeller's competition went bankrupt and out of business. Rockefeller also implemented the policy of horizontal integration. After driving competitors to the brink of financial failure through predatory pricing, he invited some of them to merge their local companies into his conglomerate. Most agreed because they had no other choice. Horizontal integration is this method where a large company buys out or merges with like competitors to gain a bigger control of the market. Carnegie would also do this as well with his company, Carnegie Steel. Ultimately, Standard Oil would become a monopoly, and in 1882, Rockefeller's lawyers created a new legal form of business domination, the trust. It organized a small group of associates, the Board of Trustees, to hold stock from a group of combined firms, managing them as a single entity. As one large group, the combined firms would control prices and the U.S. oil supply. Rockefeller's trust would also be so successful, he would soon set sights on global markets, including in the Mexican oil fields and competing overseas against the Russian and Middle Eastern producers. With the implementation of vertical and horizontal integration, predatory pricing, and trusts, companies like Standard Oil and Carnegie Steel were able to eliminate almost all of their competitors and control their respective industries. Without any true competitors, there is no reason for them to keep their prices low. No competitors in an industry means no more low prices for the American consumer. Once they had cornered the market, companies like Standard Oil would raise their prices to maximize profits, knowing consumers had no other option but to buy their product. Because of the power of the company had, Standard Oil was often depicted as an evil company. Here you can see the company being depicted as an octopus that has tentacles squeezing the White House, the Supreme Court, and the American people. To gain their respective fortunes, the industrialists of the Gilded Age also had to keep their labor costs as low as possible. Carnegie's workers would work long hours in steel mills such as these. Workers labored for long, oftentimes 14-hour days, in hot, unpleasant conditions. Steelwork is dangerous, tiring, and hard on your body. Danger was always present for Carnegie's steelworkers. Here you can see some of these dangerous conditions, with large buckets and cauldrons suspended in the air, which are actually filled with 2,000-degree molten metal. Because of the long hours and hot metal, accidents were often prevalent in steel mills. Henry Frick was a businessman with a reputation for being staunch and hard-nosed. Frick was hired by Carnegie to help run and reorganize Carnegie Steel, a decision he would soon regret. One of the many mills that Frick oversaw was in Homestead, Pennsylvania. Here workers were upset over their wages, their hours, and their working conditions, and they went on strike. A strike is when workers refuse to work until a deal is reached between management and the union. In retaliation, Frick hired the Pinkertons, an army for hire, to help keep order and break up the strike. Upon the Pinkertons' arrival, the strike turned violent. Pinkertons fired into the crowd, and the news of the violence at Homestead gave Carnegie and his company extremely bad press. Eventually, the army would be brought in to restore order. Labor conflicts such as these would happen often during the Gilded Age, and we will look at one more violent strike towards the end of this lecture. As Carnegie Steel grew, and as Andrew Carnegie grew older, eventually investment banker J.P. Morgan would set his eyes on the new industry, and he would purchase Carnegie Steel for $480 million in 1901, the equivalent of about $13.6 billion today. That same year, Morgan would merge Carnegie Steel with a group of other steel businessmen to create the world's first billion-dollar company, U.S. Steel. One thing that Carnegie, Morgan, and Rockefeller did was use their wealth and power to influence politics in America. They viciously fought and lobbied against legislation that would hurt their businesses, and during the election of 1900, the three of them helped fund William McKinley's run for re-election, where America saw a rematch of the 1896 election, where the Democrats again tried running William Jennings Bryan as their candidate. That year, many wealthy industrialists were worried about a young, upstart Republican politician named Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt was a war hero from the Spanish-American War and was the current governor of New York and gaining popularity within the Republican Party. He had also boisterously stated that he wanted to go after big business monopolies in America that he saw were dangerous, and he therefore wanted to protect the American consumers. Shortly before the 1900 presidential election, the Vice President, Garrett Hobart, died of heart disease in 1899, leaving McKinley in need of a new running mate. Carnegie, Morgan, and Rockefeller heavily suggested that McKinley select Theodore Roosevelt as BP. They knew that the position of vice president is rather powerless, and they figured that it would be a good place to bury the ambitious politician. While Roosevelt did help McKinley win re-election, their plan did not go exactly as planned, however, because following the assassination of William McKinley, Theodore Roosevelt will become the 26th President of the United States. Legislation was passed by Congress to combat the monopolies and the trusts, but most of it had been extremely unsuccessful. The Sherman Antitrust Act was passed back in 1890 as a way for the government to try and break up monopolies and restrict things like trusts, but it was full of loopholes and hard to enforce with a president that was unwilling to actually use it. As President Roosevelt would take power, his administration would use the act and break up over 40 trusts in the United States he saw that were damaging or harmful to the U.S. economy. One trust that he did not break up during his administration was the Standard Oil Trust, which was broken up in 1911 by Roosevelt's successor, William Taft. In the early 1900s, after Mr. Rockefeller had retired from Standard Oil, the muckraking journalist Ada Tarbell published a series of articles in McClure's magazine. The articles portrayed Mr. Rockefeller and the Standard Oil Company as ruthless and immoral, and the articles contributed to public outrage against the Standard Oil Company. Under the Taft administration, the Federal Department of Justice filed a federal antitrust lawsuit against Standard, and in 1909 they contended that the company restrained trade through its preferential deals with railroads, its control of pipelines, and by engaging in unfair practices like predatory pricing, it had driven out small competitors out of business. The case would eventually make its way to the Supreme Court, where the court ruled against Standard Oil. The court ruled that Standard Oil was participating in restraining trade and commerce of the petroleum industry, and by attempting to control the free market through fixed pricing and business combinations, the monopoly had sought to eliminate all competition. The court's decision forced Standard to break up into 34 independent companies spread out across the country and abroad. Many of these companies have since split, folded, and merged, but today the primary descendants of Standard Oil include ExxonMobil and Chevron. Many wealthy Americans would justify their wealth with Herbert Spencer's philosophy of social Darwinism, which was an idea that spurred off Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. Darwin had come up with the idea of survival of the fittest, which business leaders use to justify their own success. Spencer would argue that in society, there are certain individuals or groups of people who are more apt or fit to survive. The business tycoons would argue that they rose to riches and wealth because they were the best businessmen, plain and simple. They were the fittest and best businessmen, therefore they succeeded or survived while others did not. Spencer's idea of social Darwinism would also be used to justify other things, such as imperialism and in some cases, racial superiority. Regardless of how they justified their wealth, some of the industrialists did do things to give some of it back to American society. And as much as Carnegie and Rockefeller competed as young men to earn more than the other, as old men they competed to see who can give the most of it away. Carnegie was one of the first businessmen to practice what we call philanthropic works, or giving back to society. He wrote The Gospel of Wealth, a book that encouraged the rich to give away their money. He said in his book, "He who dies rich dies disgraced." Carnegie gave a lot of money to education and the arts, but in particular, he liked building libraries. Carnegie liked building libraries because they were a facility where he could supply the books and materials for people to access. However, it would still take someone's hard work and dedication to benefit and gain knowledge from them. A total of 2,509 Carnegie libraries were built between 1883 and 1929. The first one built in the United States was in Braddock, Pennsylvania, and is pictured here. Others, such as this one in Pittsburgh, seen shown here in early 1910, is still being used today. Carnegie also built a center for the arts in New York City called Carnegie Hall. Carnegie Hall is also still used today. Over his lifetime, Carnegie would give away over $350 million, the overwhelming majority of his fortune. While he did not start doing it until much later in his life, Rockefeller also gave to various charities and organizations. He created the Rockefeller Foundation, an organization whose purpose is to spread humanity throughout the world. Early on, it aided with overlooking public health issues with diseases like typhus, tuberculosis, and yellow fever. As the years went on, the Rockefeller Foundation made huge strides in medical education and research. The foundation would also aid in humanitarian relief. For instance, during World War I, it chartered its own ships and delivered more than $22 million in relief aid to war-torn nations, and during World War II, it helped remove more than 300 Jewish scientists and researchers from Nazi Germany. Rockefeller was also big into giving into education. He founded the University of Chicago through various donations, and there is a chapel on campus that still bears his name. In addition, he gave millions to help improve the educational system in the southern United States, where educational opportunities lacked in comparison to the North. Over his lifetime, Rockefeller would give away more than $530 million, much more than Carnegie, but Rockefeller also lived 13 years longer. J.P. Morgan was very much into helping the arts expand in the United States. In the last 2 decades of his life, he spent about 2/3 of his fortune on art and historic manuscripts. He helped fund the Metropolitan Museum of Art and helped run it for a while. He donated most of his own collection to the museum and also, as president, helped it go on a massive acquisition program. Morgan also was a board member and longtime donor to the American Museum of Natural History in New York City, which today houses massive dinosaur exhibits and fossils. And he helped to fund and create the Morgan Library and Museum by donating his historic manuscripts he had purchased and his family's collection of printed books. Vanderbilt was the least philanthropic of the tycoons. While he did fund Vanderbilt University, that was really about it. Today the university bears his name, and the mascot, Mr. Commodore, not only is a direct reference to Vanderbilt's nickname, the Commodore, but it also bears a stunning resemblance to him as well. In his will, he left $90 million, the bulk of his estate, to his favorite son, William Henry, who worked in his father's business, and $7.5 million to William's 4 sons. His other son, the sickly Cornelius Jeremiah, received only a $200,000 trust fund. His wife and his daughters allegedly received amounts ranging between $200,000 to $500,000 each, and also some property and stock shares as well for each of them. As a goodbye look at the industrialists, let's look at what they would be worth in modern money today and compare them to some of America's current tycoons. We're looking at the fortunes of the previous industrialists accounting for inflation, and their fortunes are measured as a share of the gross domestic product in 2017 dollars. As more and more Americans began to be employed by large companies such as Standard Oil and Carnegie Steel, workers began to band together to try and fight exploitation and better their working conditions and pay. While labor unions often varied on membership qualifications, they all had the same purpose of looking out for the well-being of their workers. The idea behind a labor union is strength in numbers. Labor unions practice what we call collective bargaining for their members. A small group that represents the entire union negotiate with management, and they strike a collective deal that will be accepted by all union members. During the Gilded Age, a few labor unions rose to prominence. First, the Knights of Labor was an early American labor union that did not discriminate against membership for almost anything. They took both skilled and unskilled workers and were open to any gender or race with the exception of the Chinese. The American Federation of Labor was a union for skilled workers only. It was meant as a craft union, so it was not made up of unskilled workers. Some unions also took on socialist overtones. The International Workers of the World was one such union. Eugene Debs became one of its most prominent members and would even run for president as a communist later in his political career. Although most unions try collective bargaining first, sometimes they also need to resort to labor strikes. As we have seen previously, sometimes when there's a labor strike, tensions get out of hand and violence occurs. The 1886 Haymarket riot in Chicago is an example of violence between striking Knights of Labor workers from a local McCormick factory and the police. Workers had gathered in Haymarket Square to have a rally and hear a series of speakers, and the Chicago mayor was even in attendance to make sure that the event stayed peaceful. At the end of the rally, a group of policemen came in to disperse the crowd, and as they did, an unidentified man threw a bomb at them, killing 7 policemen and at least 1 civilian. The Haymarket riot would make national news, and the violent event would soon become associated with the Knights of Labor and lead to their decline as a labor union in the United States. The event would also set off a national wave of xenophobia as scores of foreign-born radicals and labor organizers were rounded up by the police in Chicago and other major U.S. cities. In August of 1886, 8 men labeled as anarchists were convicted in a sensational and controversial trial in which the jury was considered to be biased and where no solid evidence was presented linking the defendants to the bombing. The judge imposed the death sentence on 7 of the 8 men, and the 8th was sentenced to 15 years in prison. On November 11, 1887, 4 of the men were hanged. Of the additional 3 men who were sentenced to death, 1 committed suicide on the eve of his execution, and the other 2 had their death sentences commuted to life in prison by Illinois Governor Richard J. Oglesby, who was reacting to widespread public questioning of their guilt, which later led his successor, John P. Atgeld, to eventually pardon the 3 activists that were still living in 1893 of all crimes.